In the previous lecture, we took a look at selections and how to create elements. At this point, you should have a basic understanding of the selection library. Now we'll take a look at how to manipulate those selections. Right now, I'm looking at the D3 selection page. If you scroll down a bit further, you'll come across the API reference section. We've already gone over selecting elements, so now we'll be taking a look at modifying elements. Here is what D3 has to say about these methods. After selecting elements, use the selections transformation methods to affect document content. So basically, these set of functions will allow you to add and remove attributes. You can also change the content inside elements that you have selected. It's important that you have a selection before you apply these methods. I'll talk more about that later in this lecture. Let's get started. The first thing I want to do is add some attributes. To do that, we need to call the attributes method. I'm chaining this right after appending the paragraph tag. In this case, the attribute will be applied to the paragraph tag since that is the current selection. If I wanted this to be applied to the body tag, then I need to call this method right after selecting the body tag. For now, I want to apply this attribute to the paragraph tag. This method has two parameters, which is the name of the attribute you'd like to add and the value. One of the most common attributes you'll find yourself adding is the class attribute, so let's pass that in as the first value. The second parameter for this method is optional, but usually you'll set it anyway. This will be the value for this class. I'm going to apply the foo class. We haven't defined this class, but that's okay for now. This is just an example. Just for fun, let's use another function. Right after this, I'm going to chain another method called text. As the name describes, this will add text inside the current selection. I'm going to set this to Hello World. I promise I'll break down a lot of this, but let's check to see if it's working first. Boot up your server and navigate to this page. We should see the paragraph tag being displayed with the text inside. If you were to view this inside the developer tools, then you should see the class foo being applied to this element. This is exactly what we wanted. So now that we have that working, let me break down what's going on. Back inside the editor, I want to format my code a bit. When it comes to D3, you'll be doing a lot of chaining. When you're chaining 2 or 3 methods, it doesn't really look that bad, but we're going beyond that here. Having your code all in one line just makes it really hard to read, so I'm just going to indent everything. This right here is preference and what works for you. In a lot of examples, you'll usually see code formatted like this, so it's good practice for you to get into the habit of it too. With that formatted, let's explore these 2 methods I just introduced. D3 refers to these methods as transformation methods. While they are provided inside the selection library, they do have a couple of differences from the methods we used in the previous lecture. As the name suggests, these will change how an element appears or works internally. With that being said, they will only work if you apply them to a selection you made previously. The order of methods matter a lot here. If I were to directly call this method at the very start of the chain, then this will simply not work. Another thing you should know is that transformation methods will return the selection it's being applied to. These methods will not create a new element, nor will they select a brand new element. This is why I can call the text method right afterwards. This attribute method will add the class foo to the paragraph tag, and then it will return the paragraph selection to be used by the next method. In this example, this would be the text method, and of course, the text method will return the same paragraph selection. In my code, you can see that I'm still logging the element into the console. Let's go back to the browser and see what selection is returned. As expected, we should see the paragraph tag being selected. You'll see that the class foo is being appended to the name. This is great because we have a real-time representation of the element in JavaScript. If you're adding an attribute that isn't a class or ID, then you most likely won't see it like this. There are 2 ways to check if an attribute is added. You can go to the Elements tab and check the element yourself. Here I see the class is definitely being applied. Alternatively, you can check the console and look into the object deeply. Inside this object, I can see we have a property named attributes. This is where all the HTML attributes are stored. Eventually, after digging through a little bit, I'll find the class attribute and its value foo. I know I've said it a few times, but I'll say it again. It's not important that you understand what's inside these objects. A lot of this is for D3 to use. Usually I don't find myself looking into these objects since everything is generated in HTML form. When I do look into these objects, it's because I'm desperate and I don't understand what's going on. In these cases, I try to understand the JavaScript object D3 provides so I can debug my code properly. The attribute property is the one I find myself checking the most. Alright, now that we understand that, let's go back to our script. So one thing I want to mention is that the attribute method will override an attribute even if it exists. For example, right now I'm adding the class foo, but let's say later in my program I wanted to add another class. Well, let's see what happens when I call the attribute method with the values of class and bar. This should add the class bar to the element. After making these changes, let's refresh the page and inspect the element. As you can see here, the class foo is completely gone. This is because the attribute method removed the original value and replaced it with the new value. There are two solutions here. We could update the attribute method to contain both classes, but this isn't practical. This is because data can be dynamic. If we needed to apply classes after a while, then trying to rewrite the attributes can become hard to manage. Luckily, D3 provides an alternative method for this. I'm going to comment out both these method calls. Then I'm going to call a method called class. This is a special method meant specifically for adding and removing classes from an element. You simply pass in the class name and then whether it should be added or removed. The class I want to add is foo. To specify if it'll be added or removed, then you just pass in true or false respectively. I want this to be added, so I'll set this to true. If this class already exists, then nothing happens. I'm going to call this method again, except this time I'm going to pass in bar and also set this to true. The great thing about this method is that it won't completely overwrite the attributes. Let's refresh the page and see what we get. As expected, we'll now see both classes being applied. There's one last thing I want to show you, and that is adding inline CSS. It's very simple and you may have an idea of how it would look like. At the very end of this chain, I'm going to call the style method. This will accept the name of the CSS property and its value. I'll keep it simple and set the color property to blue. Refresh the page after making these changes. The text has now turned blue. So that's how you would manipulate selections. There's actually more things you can do, but we'll learn more about those as the course progresses. One of the most important things you should understand is whether or not a certain method will return a new selection or return the one it's being applied to. It's always a good idea to check out the documentation to confirm just in case you forget.